Nantucket, October 2004. The gown is couture. The guests are the kind of people whose names you only see in the society pages. Flown in just to sing for the evening, the Boys' Choir of Harlem, their voices carrying across a stretch of Nantucket that most of the people here could have bought outright. This is the wedding of Stephanie and Mark. The bride is 30 and radiant. Sure, she's found the love of her life. Mark is 40, handsome, divorced, rich, though the money is the least interesting thing about him. He's the son of a legend, the son of the man half the people in this room have trusted with their fortunes. His father is here, too. He keeps to the edge of the floor, quiet and easy to overlook, and watches everyone else dance. At one point in the night, the bride spots him standing there alone, and on pure impulse, she grabs his hand and pulls him out onto the floor. He stiffens, caught off guard, and does what one guest later called the awkward little white guy shuffle, probably biting his lip the whole time. To Stephanie, in that moment, he's just her shy, soft-spoken father-in-law, a man of few words. She has no idea who she's actually dancing with. The man whose hand she's holding is, at that very moment, running a fraud so enormous it will eventually be measured in the tens of billions of dollars. She is dancing with the most successful con artist in human history. Worse still, there's something she couldn't have grasped that night. She only pieced it together years later, and even then she could describe it only with a horror that never quite left her voice. He stood there watching everyone dance, and he knew that every single person in that room was going to be destroyed. His name was Bernard Lawrence Madoff, and to understand him, you have to understand the one thing that sets his crime apart from every other con in history. He stole $65 billion, and he made the people he was stealing from feel grateful for the privilege. Chapter 1. The Impossible Paradox. Let's get the scale out of the way first, because the number is so large it stops meaning anything. When the fraud finally collapsed, the account statements Bernie Madoff had been mailing to his clients said they collectively held about $65 billion. $65 billion. Most of that figure was money that never existed, decades of fake profits typed onto paper by a handful of people on a single floor of a Manhattan high-rise. The real cash that actual human beings handed over and lost was somewhere in the range of $17 to $20 billion. Either way, it was the largest Ponzi scheme the world had ever seen, by a margin so wide that second place isn't even in the conversation. But what makes Madoff stand out in the entire history of financial crime is not the size. Most con men have to chase their victims. They cold call and flatter, and when that doesn't work, they lean on urgency. Act now. This won't last. That kind of pressure is the engine behind almost every scam ever run. Madoff did the opposite. Madoff made people beg. You couldn't just walk up and invest with Bernie Madoff. You had to be invited, vouched for by somebody who knew somebody, and even then he might turn you away. And being turned away only made you want it more. Financial writers gave it a name. They called it the velvet rope syndrome. Like a nightclub with a line around the block, the very difficulty of getting in became the proof that inside was something worth having. People who got accepted didn't feel like customers. They felt like they had been chosen. When you feel chosen, you don't ask questions. You're afraid the wrong question might get you uninvited. So the absurdity compounds. A man builds a machine that takes people's life savings and quietly funnels them into his own pockets. And those same people write him thank you notes. They put him on the boards of their charities, call him the smartest man they've ever met, and lobby their own friends and relatives for the honor of handing him more. The investors thanked the thief. That is the riddle at the center of this story. How does one soft-spoken man from Queens convince some of the most sophisticated investors on the planet, hedge fund managers, private bankers, European aristocrats, even a Nobel laureate, to thank him while he robbed them blind for the better part of 2 decades? The answer isn't that Madoff was a financial genius. He wasn't, not really. The answer is that he understood something far more powerful than markets. He understood people. Chapter 2. The Struggler from Queens. To find where it begins, you have to go back to a modest red brick house on a tree-lined street in Laurelton, Queens, in the years just after the Second World War. Bernard Madoff was born on the 29th of April, 1938, the second of three children. His parents, Ralph and Sylvia, were the children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who had fled to America to escape the pogroms and the poverty of the Old World. They had married in 1932, at the very bottom of the Great Depression, and Ralph worked a string of unremarkable jobs. At one point, he was an assistant manager at a wholesale jewelry store. By the time Bernie was a boy, the family had clawed its way up to that little house with the small garage, the picture of striving middle-class respectability. By every account, the Madoffs were a close and loving family, and Bernie was an ordinary kid. He played stickball in the street. He rode his bike around the neighborhood. There was nothing about him that announced what was coming, except for one thing. He was, in his own quiet way, a disappointment to himself. Academically, Bernie was average at best, and on the sports field he did worse. With girls, he barely registered at all. He had a crush on a girl named Elsa, made his clumsy teenage attempts to win her over, and watched her choose his best friend instead, a rejection that stung for years. He got a girlfriend in middle school, a girl named Marcia, but she eventually broke it off, and decades later she would explain why with brutal simplicity. She didn't think Bernie was smart enough for her. He was always falling short, always just shy of the honor society he wanted so badly to join. As she put it, he was always the struggler. Struggler. That was the word, and it stuck. This was a boy who watched his classmates breeze past him, the kids who would go on to Harvard and Yale while he scraped his way into the University of Alabama, mostly because it was easy to get into. A boy who felt, every single day, that he was not as clever as the people around him. That feeling, the ache of being underestimated, would never leave him. But somewhere in adolescence, Bernie discovered there was one game he could win. Not the game his smarter classmates were playing, a different one. He could make money, and he could lie. There's a small story from his school days that, in hindsight, reads like a warning shot. The class was assigned to give an oral book report. Bernie hadn't read his book. He hadn't even opened it. So when his turn came, he stood up and calmly described, in vivid detail, a book called Hunting and Fishing by an author named Peter Gunn. He invented all of it on the spot, the plot and the characters and the dates. Peter Gunn was the name of a popular TV detective at the time. It was a joke, a wink at the whole class. The teacher missed it completely. She gave him a glowing grade. He had stood in front of a room full of people, fabricated something out of thin air, delivered it with total confidence, and been rewarded for it. Lesson learned. Meanwhile, the bank account that 2 summer jobs were building, lifeguarding at the beach and installing lawn sprinklers under the hot sun, was growing nicely. As his savings swelled while his smarter classmates stayed broke, a worldview crystallized in the mind of that struggling boy. Brains, the kind measured by report cards, weren't the thing. Money was the thing. Money was the scoreboard that actually mattered. And on that scoreboard, Bernie Madoff was finally, for the first time in his life, winning. And there was Ruthie. Ruth Alpern, a popular, outgoing girl he met at Far Rockaway High. His temperamental opposite, all warmth and personality where he was quiet and watchful. They became inseparable. When Alabama was over, he followed her back to New York and enrolled at Hofstra to study political science. In 1959 they married. The struggler had found the one person who believed, totally and without reservation, that he was going to be somebody. He intended to prove her right. Chapter 3. Building a Real Empire. Most tellings of the Madoff story rush straight to the crime. But the years before, it explained everything that came after. Before Bernie Madoff was the world's greatest fraud, he was the real thing. In 1960, at the age of 22, he took the savings from those summer jobs, a few $1,000s, and, with a loan he later said came from his father-in-law, Saul Alpern, registered a company with his own name on the door, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. He set up shop, using space in Saul's Manhattan accounting firm. On a single day, he sat for the exam to become a licensed stockbroker, and the much harder exam to run his own brokerage, and passed both. In one stroke, the average student who couldn't crack the honor society had earned the right to operate his own Wall Street firm. He started at the very bottom of the food chain, trading what were called penny stocks, tiny companies too small and too cheap for the big firms to bother with. It was unglamorous, grinding work, long hours and cold calls for thin margins. But Bernie had two instincts that turned out to be worth more than any pedigree. The first was a love of technology, at a time when Wall Street still ran on paper, shouting men and chalk. While the establishment clung to the old ways, Madoff embraced computers. He wired up his office with the newest equipment he could get his hands on. He bet, early and hard, that the future of trading was electronic, that screens and quotes flashing across the country would replace the chaos of the trading floor. He was right, and he didn't only ride that wave, he helped build it. Madoff pushed and funded the kind of electronic quotation system that would become the backbone of a brand new stock market. That market was the NASDAQ. Today it's the second largest stock exchange on earth, the home of Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Bernie Madoff would go on to serve as its chairman. The second instinct was about flow. Madoff figured out he could pay big brokerage houses, household names, a small fee, around a penny a share, in exchange for sending their customer orders to him to execute. It's a practice called paying for order flow, and at the time it was clever and a little controversial, but it meant that an enormous river of trades passed through Madoff's firm every single day. At its peak, his market-making operation was handling something like 9% of the trading volume on the New York Stock Exchange. A serious, respected, profitable Wall Street machine run alongside his brother Peter and, in time, his two sons. This is the foundation. This is everything. Because by the 1980s, Bernie Madoff was, by any honest measure, a Wall Street titan. He was reportedly clearing more than $100 million a year from the legitimate business. He chaired NASDAQ. He sat on industry boards. He was the Wizard of Wall Street, the man who had helped drag the entire market into the modern age. Which raises the question no one has ever been able to fully answer, including Madoff himself. He had it all. He had real money, real status, a real and genuinely impressive company. He didn't need to steal a dime. And yet, in the shadow of all that legitimacy, he was already running a second business. A quiet one. One that operated, as investigators later put it, completely under the radar. A business almost no one on Wall Street even knew existed. That was the business that would swallow the world. Chapter 4. The Secret Side Business. It started small. So small it's almost touching. Alongside the trading firm, Madoff quietly took on a handful of investment clients, people who would hand him their money and let him grow it. His very first was a dressmaker named Carl Shapiro, who gave the young Bernie $100,000 to manage. Madoff grew it impressively, and Shapiro would remain devoted to him for the next half-century, eventually becoming one of his largest investors and one of his most devastated victims. But Madoff understood early that he couldn't find clients one at a time. That was too slow. So he designed a system, and the system was built around people he called feeders. The idea was elegant. The feeders would go out and gather money from their own networks of friends and family. They'd hand that pooled money to Bernie. Bernie would invest it, generate returns, keep a slice for himself, and pass the rest back to the feeder, who took a slice too before passing it on to the actual investors. Everybody up the chain got paid. His first feeders were the people closest to him. His father-in-law, Saul Alpern, and two young accountants who worked in Saul's firm. Their names were Frank Avellino and Michael Bienes. And these two men, small-time accountants from a modest world, would become the unwitting architects of the early Ponzi scheme. The men who first proved to Bernie just how much money could be pulled out of thin air if you simply promised people enough and asked them no questions. Years later, Michael Bienes sat for an interview, an old man by then, and described those early days with a candor that is almost unbelievable. He explained that he and Frank started with just a couple million in the account, big money to them at the time. They issued promissory notes to their clients, guaranteeing fixed returns. Big investors got 18%. Smaller ones got 17, 16, sometimes as low as 15. And the reason the math worked was simple. Bernie guaranteed them 20% or more, so all they had to do was pocket the spread. Did Bienes understand how Madoff was actually generating those returns? Not even slightly. Asked what made him believe Bernie could deliver 20% year after year, his answer was almost philosophical. "How do I know?" he said. "How do you split an atom? I know you can split it. I don't know how. How does an airplane fly?" He never asked Bernie. Why would he? He wouldn't have understood the answer anyway. Something about arbitrage, between bonds and stocks, blah, blah, blah. That was the whole due diligence. Blah, blah, blah. And the money rolled in. By the mid-1980s, Avellino and Bienes were pulling something like $10 million a year just for passing other people's money to Bernie. Bienes described the feeling without an ounce of shame. Was it easy money? He was asked. Easy, he said. Easy peasy. Like a money machine. He bragged that he never lifted a heavy weight, never worked hard a day in his life, that the whole thing flew itself like an airplane on autopilot. And when the good fortune got so absurd that even he started to wonder why he was so lucky, he found an answer that let him sleep at night. He and his wife decided that God had given it to them. God wanted them to have this. But there was a line they swore they never crossed, and Bienes repeated it like a mantra. We were never pigs. We were never pigs. That was the rule. In his mind. Take a small clip off the top, never get greedy, and the machine keeps running forever. The trouble was that the machine was not, in fact, an airplane on autopilot. It was a Ponzi scheme. And a Ponzi scheme has one fatal requirement that no amount of restraint can satisfy. It must always, always bring in more money than it pays out. Because there were no real investments. There was no 20% return being generated by some genius strategy. There was only new money coming in the front door, being used to pay the people who'd come in earlier, with a man named Bernie skimming his fortune off the river as it passed. It worked beautifully, until for the first time, somebody official started asking questions. Chapter 5. The Ghost of Charles Ponzi. Where does the word Ponzi even come from? And why was Madoff's version so much more dangerous than the original? The name belongs to Charles Ponzi, an Italian immigrant who, back in the 1920s, dreamed up a scheme involving international postal reply coupons. He promised investors something irresistible, 50% returns in just 90 days. The mechanics were simple, and they are the mechanics of every Ponzi scheme since. There was no real profit being generated. Ponzi simply took the money from new investors and used it to pay the promised returns to earlier ones. Word of those fabulous payouts spread like fire. New investors stampeded in, and for a while the whole thing perpetuated itself, with Ponzi skimming a fortune off the top. Then, as it always must, it collapsed. Because here is the iron law that dooms every single one of these schemes. It is mathematically guaranteed to fail. There are only ever three endings. The schemer grabs what's left and runs. The supply of new investors dries up, or everyone demands their money back at once, and the empty vault is finally exposed. There is no fourth option. There is no version where it just keeps working forever. The collapse isn't a risk. It's a certainty. The only question is when. Charles Ponzi lasted about a year. So did most who followed. And that's what makes Madoff's scheme so genuinely extraordinary, so much more sophisticated than anything before it. Most Ponzi schemes are loud. They have to be. They promise enormous greed-inflaming returns to attract money fast, and that very flashiness is what gets them caught. Ponzi's 50% in 90 days was a screaming red flag. Madoff did the opposite. And this was perhaps his single shrewdest move. He kept his promised returns modest, not 50%, not even 20%, to the end investors. Something more like 10 or 12% a year, high enough to be wonderful, low enough to be believable. He found the perfect sweet spot, the rate that whispered steady and safe rather than shouting too good to be true. A flashy Ponzi burns bright and dies in a year. Madoff's burned low and slow, and so it lasted not 1 year, but, by some estimates, the better part of 2 decades, possibly longer. The genius wasn't promising people the moon. It was promising them just a little more than the market, forever, without the scary parts. He had taken a crude, century-old swindle and refined it into something patient, respectable, and almost invisible. He had built the Ponzi scheme that wasn't supposed to be possible, the one that could go on and on and on. Chapter 6. 1992. The first near-death experience. By the early 1990s, Avellino and Bienni's had a problem that was the opposite of failure. They had too much success. They had been at it for years, opening a second office in Florida, scooping up doctors and art dealers and church friends, and they had quietly amassed more than 3,000 clients. 3,000. The issue was that under the rules, if you advise more than a tiny handful of investors, you are legally required to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Avellino and Bienni's had never registered. They were, in plain terms, operating an enormous, unlicensed investment advisory. They knew it was a problem. Bienni's admitted they had doubts, that they went to Bernie and said maybe they should get licensed, maybe they should do this properly. And every time, Bernie talked them out of it. He told them he'd consulted the biggest lawyers on Wall Street, that everyone said it was fine, that they were nothing more than employees of his father-in-law and clients of his firm. Bienni said it plainly decades later. Bernie was always calling the shots. We were captive to him. He owned us, so they didn't register. And in 1992, it caught up with them. An investment advisor out in Seattle had heard about the suspiciously steady returns Avellino and Bienni's were promising, found the whole thing fishy, and reported it to the SEC. The regulators launched an investigation. They suspected exactly what was happening, that this looked like a Ponzi scheme. Madoff moved fast. He recommended the 2 panicking accountants hire a specific lawyer, a man named Ira Sorkin, who had handled fraud cases and had even run the SEC's New York office himself. Sorkin tried to find a way to keep them in business, but the regulators had lost patience. The order came down. Shut it all down. Return every dollar to the investors. Pay the fines. By that point, Avellino and Bienni's had $441 million sitting with Madoff. This was the moment the entire catastrophe could have ended. November 1992. The SEC is investigating a suspected Ponzi scheme. They follow the money, and the money leads straight to Bernard Madoff. So what happened? Nothing. Nothing happened to Madoff. The SEC was, at first, terrified that the money simply wouldn't be there, that this was a classic Ponzi, and the $400 million had evaporated. But when they traced it back to Madoff, they relaxed. Because Madoff was a name. He was the chairman of NASDAQ. He handled 9% of the volume on the New York Stock Exchange. He had a sterling reputation. Surely a man like that wasn't running a fraud. They had Madoff in their sights. They knew he was managing money for thousands of clients without being registered as an advisor, and they let it go. They concluded, somehow, nothing adverse. Years later, an investigator put the absurdity into words. The law says, if you advise 15 or more clients, you have to register. Madoff had 3,200. And 3,200, he noted dryly, seems like more than 15. But the SEC fined the feeders, made them return the money, and let the man at the center of it all walk away completely untouched. And even the return of the money wasn't clean. Madoff paid back the bulk of the $441 million, but he shortchanged them by about $18 million. Avellino and Bienni stormed into Bernie's new offices in the Lipstick Building in Midtown to confront him. Bienni's, by his own account, exploded, cursing Bernie, blaming him for the disaster, screaming that they'd asked to register and Bernie had said no, no, no. And Madoff, in that cool, low, unbothered voice that so many people would later describe, simply told him, "I've heard enough from you. Stop. You're starting to get to me." And just like that, Bienes folded. He apologized. He backed down. He said he was a very scared person, and let's forget what I said and move on. The man Bernie owned, even in his rage, could not stay angry at his owner. There's a postscript to 1992 that tells you everything about what kind of man Madoff was, and how the rot kept spreading. Officially, the feeders were shut down, and the clients were sent away with their money. But sources told investigators it didn't really stop. Avellino and Bienes, those sources alleged, simply rerouted clients to Madoff through other front men, most notably a Florida churchgoer named Michael Sullivan, who took on dozens of their old accounts and pumped the money right back to Bernie. Bienes has heatedly denied steering anyone. But the documented pattern of money continuing to flow suggests the SEC action that was supposed to be a firewall turned out to be little more than a speed bump. And while the world moved on, Avellino and Bienes got rich. The Avellinos bought a $4.5 million house in Palm Beach and filled it with paintings by Degas and de Kooning and Hopper and Bacon, worth tens of millions. The Bienes became celebrated local philanthropists, accepting awards, hailed as Renaissance men. The struggler from Queens had made his early accomplices wealthy beyond imagining. But by then, Bernie didn't really need them anymore. The 1992 scare had taught him something. The SEC had looked right at him and blinked. He was, it turned out, too big to question. It was time to go after far, far bigger money. Chapter 7. The Machine of Greed. If the 1980s belonged to small accountants in the Catskills, the 1990s and 2000s belonged to a glittering new class of feeder: the hedge funds, the private bankers, the fund-of-funds managers. And they didn't have to be recruited. They came running. To understand why, you have to understand the deal Madoff offered, because it was, on its face, insane, and that insanity was the bait. Normally, when you run a fund, you charge fees. The standard in the industry was the famous 2 and 20, 2% of the assets you manage, plus 20% of the profits. That's how money managers get rich. But Madoff told the feeder funds something they could scarcely believe. He said, "I won't charge you any fees at all. I make my money on the trading and the commissions through my market-making business. You bring me the clients, and you keep all the fees yourself." The math of that offer was almost too good to print. A feeder fund could take an investor's money, hand the actual investing to Bernie for free, charge that investor a full 2 and 20, and pocket every cent of it for doing next to nothing. It was, in the words of one observer, free money. All these funds had to do was dump money into Madoff and count their profits. No real work, no real risk, or so it seemed. Just an endless river of fees for the privilege of being a middleman. Of course, to anyone paying attention, that arrangement should have screamed danger. What money manager on earth voluntarily turns down $100 million a year in fees? What genius gives away the most lucrative part of the deal? The honest answer is, a man who isn't actually trading anything, and who needs his feeders desperate, loyal, and grateful enough never to look too closely. The no-fee structure wasn't generosity. It was a leash made of gold. The most important of these feeders was a firm called Fairfield Greenwich Group. It was founded by a private banker named Walter Noel, a courtly Southerner with an excellent reputation and connections that stretched deep into old money circles in America and abroad, and a partner named Jeffrey Tucker, a former SEC lawyer, of all things, with a passion for horse racing. In the early days, Fairfield Greenwich struggled, until Tucker brought Walter a guy he knew with unbelievably consistent returns. "Come meet him," Tucker said. "Maybe there's a product here." There was. They built an entire fund, Fairfield Century, for the sole purpose of funneling money to Madoff. And once they did, the whole thing took off like a rocket. What made Fairfield so devastatingly effective wasn't only the returns. It was the marketing. and the marketing was a family affair. Walter Knoll had a string of glamorous, well-connected daughters, and those daughters married into exactly the kind of international moneyed families you'd want if you were trying to sell an exclusive investment to the global elite. One son-in-law was a Colombian banker who opened up Latin America. Others worked the Middle East and Europe. The Noel family's annual Christmas card became a kind of running advertisement for their own rising fortunes, a beautiful, photogenic dynasty whose unofficial motto, according to one insider, was, "If we act rich, we will become rich." They were selling a lifestyle as much as a fund. They were selling the dream of belonging to a world most people only read about in glossy magazines. And the fees were staggering. For a fund like Fairfield Century, those client fees added up to roughly $100 million a year. $100 million every year for marketing, while the man who supposedly did the actual investing charged nothing. Fairfield was the biggest, but it was hardly alone. A whole cottage industry sprang up. Advisors, accountants, attorneys, fund of funds, all of them doing one thing, feeding money to Bernie. There was Ezra Merkin, the respected president of a prestigious Fifth Avenue synagogue, who steered more than $1 billion of his clients' money to Madoff through his own funds while collecting handsome fees. There was Stanley Shea, who worked the Hollywood crowd in Beverly Hills. Bob Jaffe operated in Boston and Palm Beach. Tremont was a major hedge fund operation in on it too, each of them a tributary. And every tributary flowed into the same secret floor in the same Manhattan building. The machine wasn't really a financial strategy. It was a social network weaponized, a chain of trust and greed and prestige, in which every link got paid for not asking the one question that mattered. Chapter 8. Global Contagion. The genius of the feeder system was that it didn't stay in America. It went global. And nowhere did it metastasize more spectacularly than in Europe, and above all, in the world capital of financial discretion, Geneva. Switzerland's private bankers built their entire civilization on secrecy. They are the people you go to when you have a great deal of money and a great desire that no one ask about it. And so when Madoff's feeders came knocking, offering steady returns and, crucially, a kickback for any banker who brought in clients, Geneva embraced him completely. The pitch was almost comically aggressive. Bring us your clients, and we'll hand you back a percentage of our fee for every one. By 2008, fully a third of all Geneva fund managers had money with Madoff, to the tune of around $14 billion. One investor tried to explain the psychology of it, and his explanation is the key to the whole European chapter. The hedge fund world, he said, works a little like Hollywood. You don't really understand what the stars do, but you have to invest in the big names anyway, because it's a big name, because everyone else is. Because being associated with the star is its own form of status. Madoff wasn't a fund, he was a celebrity, and Europe's elite collected him like an Hermes bag. And the man who carried that celebrity into the heart of European high society was a French aristocrat named Thierry de la Villehouche. Tall, charming, an avid sailor, connected by blood and friendship to European royalty, Thierry was exactly the kind of person who could open doors that money alone could not. He ran a firm called Access International, and onto his marketing team he recruited names out of a fairy tale, a prince of Yugoslavia, a man once married to a princess of Monaco. They threw lavish dinners with fine wine and famous guests, and then came the soft, irresistible sell. I have this brilliant money manager in New York. He makes money in any weather. Let me introduce you. Put your money in my fund, and I'll hand it to Bernie Madoff. The clients they reeled in were almost unimaginably wealthy. Among them, reportedly, was the heiress to the L'Oreal fortune, at the time the richest woman in the world. Thierry didn't just sell Madoff. He believed in him, completely, with the faith of a true convert. He put in his own money. He put in his family's money. He put in the money of half the royalty he knew. His own brother said it plainly. Thierry believed completely in Madoff. But there was a condition that traveled with every dollar on every continent. Madoff had one absolute, non-negotiable rule that he imposed on every feeder every fund, every banker, in Geneva and Palm Beach and New York alike. You were forbidden from putting his name in writing. His name could not appear in your marketing materials. It could not appear in your prospectus. The reason was that Madoff was still, after all these years, after thousands of clients and billions under management, not registered with the SEC as an investment advisor. So he simply made invisibility a term of doing business. One feeder, Sandra Mansky, a hedge fund veteran who, with a certain irony, had publicly campaigned for more transparency in the industry, was asked about it directly. "Did Madoff tell you not to put him in your prospectus?" "Yes," she admitted. "He did. It was one of the conditions of getting an account." And so, an entire global industry, managing tens of billions of dollars, agreed to keep the name of the man at the center of it all a secret. They didn't mention to clients that they had money with Madoff. Among themselves, they didn't talk about it. It was, as one of them put it, something you simply didn't discuss, which is exactly, precisely, how Bernie Madoff wanted it. The strangeness of this is easy to skate past. The most respected money manager in the world, the man everyone was desperate to invest with, the supposed safe harbor in every storm, and his single iron rule was that no one could ever write his name down. The most sought-after secret on Wall Street was that you had given your money to the most famous man on Wall Street. The willingness of so many smart people to accept a rule that bizarre, without protest, tells you everything about the spell he had cast. They wanted the returns so badly that they agreed to pretend the source didn't exist. Chapter 9. The Spoils. So, what was all this fiction actually buying for the man at the center of it? What did the largest fraud in history look like from the inside, in the daily life of Bernie Madoff? It looked like staggering, almost obsessive comfort. There was a multi-million-dollar Manhattan penthouse, its wraparound terrace high above the city. A beachfront mansion in Montauk, on the eastern tip of Long Island. In Palm Beach, Florida, he kept a home and a 55-foot vintage yacht he named Bull, a small, telling joke from a man who lived a lie. A villa waited in the south of France. Private jets carried the family between all of them. Bernie Madoff lived the kind of life most people only encounter in magazines, the exact lifestyle his feeders were selling, the dream of belonging to a world above the ordinary one. And the way he lived inside that wealth reveals something about the machinery of his mind. By his daughter-in-law Stephanie's account, Bernie was a compulsive, neat freak, a man for whom everything had to be perfect, controlled, ordered. His shirts were color-coordinated. His shoes were lined up with precision. He collected things and arranged them obsessively. 17 Rolex watches, 100 pairs of Belgian loafers, all of it catalogued and immaculate. This was a man who needed the world around him to be flawless, symmetrical, under his control. And here the story shades from documented fact into careful interpretation, but it's a connection worth following. Based on what those closest to him described, you can reasonably read that same craving for control straight into the fraud itself. An operation whose entire appeal was its impossible smoothness, a return that never wavered, a chart with no ugly bumps, one perfect, unbroken line that climbed forever. A man who couldn't bear a crooked row of shoes on his closet floor, the inference goes, may simply have been incapable of tolerating a crooked line on a performance chart, even when the only way to keep that line straight was to invent it. There were uglier notes, too, small cruelties that hinted at what lived under the gentle, soft-spoken surface. Stephanie recalled being disturbed by how Bernie and Ruth treated their housekeeper, complaining endlessly about her work, even mocking her accent. Here was a man who could charm Nobel laureates and European royalty, who radiated warmth to the people whose money he wanted, and who could turn cold and small towards someone with no power over him. The kindness, it turned out, was a tool, deployed where it was useful and withdrawn where it wasn't. And perhaps the strangest detail of all, for a man revered as one of the great financial minds of his era, Bernie Madoff showed almost no interest in the life of the mind. Stephanie said she never once saw him read a book, never saw him read a newspaper, He didn't have deep intellectual conversations. The Wizard of Wall Street, the supposed genius investor, was incurious about almost everything except appearances, order, and money. It was Ruth, his wife, who had the personality, quick, funny, cracking jokes at Bernie's expense while he sat quietly by. It's a haunting portrait when you hold it next to the public image. The legend was a brilliant, all-knowing master of markets. The reality, the available accounts suggest, was a controlling, incurious man who collected watches and couldn't be bothered to open a book. Which leads to an unsettling possibility, that he had built his entire towering reputation not on genius at all, but on the performance of genius. The black box, the proprietary secret, the respect he demanded. Viewed through that lens, it all reads less like the toolkit of a financial wizard and more like an elaborate costume, one worn so long and so convincingly that even the people sleeping under his roof never glimpsed the man underneath. Chapter 10. The Engine Room. So how did the magic actually work? If Madoff wasn't trading, if there were no real investments, what exactly were all these people buying? To answer that, you have to go down, 2 floors down, in the Lipstick Building, from the gleaming, legitimate market-making operation that Madoff's sons and brother ran on the 19th floor. The 17th floor was a different world. Up on 19, everything was modern and proud. Rows of young traders in their 20s and 30s, each reportedly pulling down $1 million a year, clicking away at screens, a genuine high-tech trading firm with a stellar reputation, the kind of place people joined and never left. That floor was real. 2 floors down, a dozen people worked in near-total secrecy under the direction of a man named Frank DiPascali, a high school-educated kid from Queens who had started at the firm as a teenager and risen to become Bernie's most trusted lieutenant. Nobody really understood what DiPascali did. The staff knew only that he was important, that he spoke with Bernie constantly, and that whatever Frank wanted, Frank got. Even the IT employees who had access to the floor couldn't have told you what was actually happening there. What was actually happening there was the manufacture of reality. The 17th floor produced the account statements, millions of them, printed constantly, day after day, statements showing trades that never happened. Purchases of stocks, treasuries, options, all invented, all typed into a system designed to look like the records of a real, breathtakingly consistent investment operation. One former employee described the shock of it later. The statements were just sort of made out of thin air. People spent their days spitting out documents that were pure fiction. And the operation was, in its way, brilliantly engineered for plausibility. One detail shows how far that engineering went. In an age when every other broker on Wall Street was sending instant electronic trade confirmations, Madoff insisted on mailing his confirmations by post, so they'd arrive 2, 3, even 5 days after the trade supposedly happened. Investors thought nothing of it. But that delay was a gift to a man inventing trades. With the benefit of several days' hindsight, you can look back at what the market actually did and then confirm a trade at exactly the right price. It's like placing your bet after the horse race is over. One investor was asked, "Didn't it strike you as odd that everyone else sent electronic confirmations and Bernie sent paper in the mail?" "No," she said. "We never thought anything of it. There were other clues, for anyone who looked hard enough. Statements that referenced a fund whose name had changed years earlier and was closed to new investors. Odd accounting of cash balances. Trades that, when you checked, occurred at prices the stock had never actually hit on the day in question. The fingerprints of the fraud were on the documents the whole time. They were mailed in plain envelopes to thousands of homes. Almost no one bothered to read them closely. They flipped to the last page, saw the number had gone up again, and felt rich. And on the rare occasion that an investor did call with a pointed question, the 17th floor had an answer. Frank DiPascali would get on the phone and, in effect, threaten them. One investor recalled the chill of it, being told that if she didn't like the way Madoff did business, they'd simply send her money back. It was intimidating, she said, because she didn't want her money back, and she didn't understand what was so terrible about the question she'd asked. The message was unmistakable. There were two kinds of people in Madoff's world: those who shut up and stayed grateful, and those who got shown the door. Curiosity was punished. Faith was rewarded. That was the engine, not a trading strategy, a printing press, a delay in the mail, and a culture of fear and silence, wrapped inside the reputation of the most respected man on Wall Street. Chapter 11. Why Nobody Asked. This is the question that haunts the whole story. So many sophisticated people, so many obvious red flags. How did nobody figure it out? The answer isn't that they were stupid. Many of them were brilliant. The answer is something psychologists and investigators kept circling back to with the same two words: willful blindness. Willful blindness isn't ignorance. Ignorance is when you genuinely don't know. Willful blindness is when, somewhere, deep down, you suspect, but you make the choice not to look, because looking might cost you something you desperately want to keep. And almost everyone in Madoff's orbit had something they desperately wanted to keep. The feeders had their $100 million fee streams. The investors had their steady, beautiful returns. The bankers had their kickbacks. To ask the hard question was to risk the answer, so they didn't ask. And Madoff made not asking feel sophisticated. He had this thing he called his proprietary trading model, his black box. When people pressed him on how he generated such consistent returns, he'd explain that he couldn't reveal his methods, because his competitors might steal his secret sauce. It was a strategy too special, too valuable to disclose. And amazingly, that worked. Grown men with finance degrees nodded along and accepted that they were not allowed to understand what was being done with their money, because the magic was simply too magical to explain. The same trick covered an absurdity that should have ended everything on its own. Bernie Madoff, a man supposedly managing tens of billions of dollars, had his books audited by a tiny, obscure accounting firm operating out of a storefront in a strip mall an hour north of New York City. A strip mall, and behind the door was, in effect, a single working accountant, one man, signing off on the audits of what was supposedly the largest investment advisory on the planet. When this came up, Madoff had a ready explanation, and it's almost insulting in its cleverness. He said he used a small, obscure firm precisely because he didn't want to expose his proprietary techniques to a big auditor who might leak them to competitors. The secrecy that should have terrified people, he reframed as proof of how protective he was of his precious edge. One expert later called this what it was: hogwash. No one with any real sophistication could have honestly believed that a man running tens of billions had to rely on a couple of people in a strip mall to protect a secret, but people didn't want to disbelieve it, so they swallowed it. And then there was Madoff himself, the human factor. By every account, he radiated a calm, unshakable authority. He had spent decades building genuine credibility, real status, a real company. When a skeptical reporter finally got 2 hours with him, the reporter expected to catch some flicker of nervousness, some tell. There was none. Madoff was cool as a cucumber. At one point, he simply chuckled and said, in effect, "Give me some respect. I've been in business for 40 years. We've built this great infrastructure. We have this incredible access to market information. Give me some respect." And people did. They gave the struggler from Queens the one thing he'd craved his entire life. And they gave it so completely that they handed him their fortunes along with it. That's the real lock on the door. Not a clever financial trick. A man so respected, so established, so deeply stitched into Wall Street itself, that to accuse him felt almost insane. To suspect Bernie Madoff was to suspect the system, and almost nobody was willing to do that. Almost nobody. Chapter 12. The Man Who Knew. In the late 1990s, in an investment office in Boston, a numbers man named Harry Markopolos was handed an assignment that would consume the next decade of his life. Markopolos worked at a firm called Rampart Investment Management. He was an options specialist, the kind of person who understood the deep, esoteric machinery of financial instruments the way most people understand the alphabet. His bosses had a problem. One of their trading partners kept putting money with a manager named Bernie Madoff, and that manager kept delivering 1 to 2% month after month like clockwork. Rampart wanted in on that magic. So they gave the problem to Markopolos. Reverse engineer Madoff's strategy, replicate it, and we'll pull that business our way. Markopolos sat down with Madoff's track record, and depending on which version you believe, it took him somewhere between 5 minutes and 4 hours to reach a conclusion that would define the rest of his career. It was fake. All of it. The numbers were impossible. Madoff claimed to use a strategy called a split-strike conversion, a real options technique, but one that, by its very nature, is mostly a bet on rising markets. So how? Markopolos wondered. Did Madoff make money when markets fell? When the market went up, Madoff posted a gain. When the market crashed, Madoff still posted a gain. The line on the chart marched upward at a steady, gentle, almost supernatural angle, year after year, untouched by the violence of the real world. It didn't have the volatility that is the fundamental heartbeat of all real investing. As Markopolos liked to put it, comparing it to baseball, it was like a player batting comfortably over .900 every single season for a decade. Nobody hits like that. If you see a player putting up impossible numbers like that, year after year, they're not playing baseball. They're cheating. Markopolos ran the deeper math and found it was worse than just suspicious. For Madoff's claimed strategy to actually work at the scale he was operating, he would have needed to trade more options contracts on the Chicago Exchange than physically existed in the entire market. The trades simply could not be happening, and when Markopolos canvassed the firms that would have had to be on the other side of those trades, none of them had ever done business with Madoff. The most active trader in the world was leaving no footprints anywhere, because he wasn't walking anywhere. The truth, which would only be confirmed much later, was that Madoff hadn't made a real trade for his investment clients in years. By some accounts, not since the early 1990s, possibly earlier. So, in May of 2000, Harry Markopolos did the responsible thing. He took his findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He handed them a memo laying out the case. The SEC did nothing. He didn't quit. He came back in 2001 with a more detailed complaint. He even offered to go undercover, to walk into the operation, and bring back hard proof that Bernie wasn't trading. Nothing. In 2005, he submitted his masterpiece, a 21-page memo titled, with grim wit, around the idea that the world's largest hedge fund was a fraud, laying out more than 24 specific red flags in painstaking detail. He served it to them on a platter. People who read it later said they were certain the SEC would have to act now. It was all there, gift-wrapped. The SEC did nothing, and Markopolos was not even alone. Over the years, other letters reached the SEC from other worried people. One writer warned that they were deeply concerned Madoff was running a sophisticated fraudulent pyramid scheme. Another pointed out that no down months and steady low volatility, year after year, simply did not add up. A steady drip of warnings, a chorus of alarm. And from the regulators, year after year, a wall of silence. What it cost Markopolos to keep going shows just how dangerous he believed this man was. He had reverse-engineered Madoff's client base, and he understood that Bernie was taking money from feeder funds connected to powerful and ruthless people, Russian and Latin American money, the kind of investors who do not file a polite lawsuit when they discover they've been robbed. Markopolos became convinced that if those people ever learned the truth, they might kill Madoff, and might not be too careful about anyone standing nearby. He started carrying a gun. He checked his car for bombs. He lived for years in genuine fear, all while trying to hand the government an open and shut case it refused to open. He even tried the press. He fed the story to a hedge fund journalist named Michael Okrent, who was stunned to learn how much money Madoff was secretly managing. That alone was a bombshell. Okrent got an interview, came away unsettled by Madoff's impossible calm, and wrote it up. Days later, the influential financial weekly barons picked up the thread, publicly raising the same questions. How are these returns possible? And why can no one else reproduce them? The articles caused a stir. People in Madoff's own office whispered about them. Markopolos and his allies waited, certain that now, finally, the dam would break. And the dam held. because the man it protected was simply too respected to fall. Chapter 13. The Government That Couldn't See. It is genuinely hard to overstate how many chances the SEC had, and how completely it failed to take any of them. Set aside the Markopolos memos and the warning letters for a moment. In 2004, an SEC lawyer doing her own examination of Madoff reported up the chain that his operation raised multiple red flags. She was, according to accounts, told in no uncertain terms to drop it and focus on more important matters. There was also an uncomfortable wrinkle in the background. An SEC compliance official had begun a relationship with, and would later marry, Madoff's niece, Shayna, who herself worked as a compliance officer and attorney inside the Madoff firm. When the scandal broke, this looked damning. But it's important to be precise about what was actually established. A later internal investigation by the SEC's own Inspector General found no evidence that the romance influenced the agency's decision to close its case. What it did conclude was that the situation had created, at the very least, the appearance of a conflict of interest. Fairly or not, the marriage came to symbolize the cozy, too comfortable closeness between the regulators and the world they were supposed to be policing. Finally, in January 2006, prodded once more by Markopolos, the SEC opened an official investigation, and what followed is almost beyond belief. Madoff knew the investigators were coming. In late 2005, he learned that the SEC wanted to interview the due diligence officer at Fairfield Greenwich, the person nominally responsible for verifying that Madoff was real. So Madoff got that man on the phone and coached him. There exists a transcript of this conversation, dozens of pages long, and it reads like a tutorial in obstruction. Madoff opens by telling the man, in effect, this conversation never took place. He instructs him to stay casual, not to seem worried about anything, because acting concerned would only make the investigators suspicious. He scripts the man's answers for him. Your position, Madoff tells him, is simply this. Madoff has been in business for decades. He executes a huge share of the industry's orders. He's a well-known broker, so we just assume he's doing everything properly. That single sentence is the entire fraud, distilled. It was the assumption Madoff had spent 40 years building, and now he was literally writing it into other people's mouths to recite to federal investigators. When the SEC examiners did come to his offices, insiders reported that Madoff personally fielded their questions and was visibly nervous, irritable, on edge. And the 17th floor had its own tricks for surviving an audit, tricks that have since been documented in unsettling detail. On at least one occasion, when an outside auditor demanded a trade ledger that didn't exist, DePascali's staff simply fabricated one on a computer and printed it fresh. Then, because a document hot off the printer would feel suspiciously warm and new, they cooled it in an office refrigerator and tossed it back and forth like a medicine ball to give it the worn-handled patina of age before handing it over. They were, quite literally, manufacturing and aging the evidence on demand. It didn't matter. The investigation dragged on for the better part of 2 years, and at the end of it, the SEC reached its verdict. Madoff was cleared. And then he did something so brazen it could only come from a man utterly certain of his own untouchability. Not long after the regulators closed their file, Bernie Madoff went on the record praising them, declaring, in effect, that in today's regulatory environment, it was virtually impossible to break the rules and get away with it. The man running the largest fraud in human history, having just been investigated and cleared by the very agency charged with stopping him, turned around and complimented that agency on how impossible it was to do exactly what he was doing. It was a taunt disguised as a compliment, a magician taking a bow in front of the audience he'd just robbed, and nobody got the joke. Years later, when investors and journalists learned of the remark, the audacity of it took their breath away. The man who had been right about everything, Harry Markopolos, summed up the agency's failure with a bitterness he'd earned. He said he had handed them a roadmap and a flashlight, pointed them straight at the fraud, and they had simply refused to go where he told them. After the collapse, when SEC officials were hauled before Congress, the contempt was open. One congressman raged that a single man with a few friends had uncovered this thing nearly a decade earlier, had led the agency to the pile of burning filth, had stuck their noses in it, and they still couldn't figure it out. The officials sat there and said they couldn't comment because of an ongoing investigation, after the man confessed. "Don't," one lawmaker snapped, "give yourself a pat on the back for taking action after he turned himself in." Privately, regulators offered an excuse that was true but inadequate. The agency was understaffed, overwhelmed, drowning. And no doubt it was. But that doesn't explain everything. The deeper failure was the same disease that had infected everyone else. The SEC, too, looked at Bernie Madoff, chairman of NASDAQ, a fixture of the industry, advisor to regulators, and could not bring itself to believe. They were as spellbound as his victims. The regulator, meant to be the immune system of the markets, had been hypnotized by the very prestige it should have been most suspicious of. And so the fraud rolled on, bigger every year, protected now not just by greed and willful blindness, but by an official seal of approval from the United States government. It would take a force more powerful than any regulator to bring it down. It would take the collapse of the entire world economy. Chapter 14. The Collapse. For all his cleverness, the one truth Bernie Madoff could never escape is this: a Ponzi scheme is a shark that has to keep swimming. It survives only as long as more money flows in than flows out. The moment that reverses, the moment more people want their money back than are putting it in, the whole thing dies, instantly and completely. There is no clever escape, because there was never any real money. There were only later investors paying earlier ones, with Bernie skimming the difference. For decades, the river flowed the right way. New money poured in faster than old money was withdrawn, and Madoff stayed afloat. The most chilling implication of how his fraud was built is this. Based on everything investigators later reconstructed, he very likely could have died a free man, in his sleep, in his Manhattan penthouse, with the secret intact, if only the world had stayed calm. The scheme wasn't buckling under its own weight. Something from the outside would have to break it. The world did not stay calm. In 2008, the global financial system began to come apart. The American housing bubble, inflated by years of reckless mortgage lending, burst. Banks teetered. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Markets went into freefall. By that autumn, Wall Street screens glowed an unbroken, terrifying red, and trillions of dollars in wealth simply vanished. It was the worst financial crisis in 3 generations. And for a strange, dark moment, the catastrophe actually made Madoff look better. As real funds bled out and real investments cratered, Bernie's account statements kept their serene upward march. While everyone else was being slaughtered, Bernie was still posting his steady gains. To panicking investors, that made him more irresistible than ever. Why stay in the collapsing market when you could move your money to the one man who made money in any weather? In the middle of the worst storm in living memory, people were moving more money into Madoff, not less, pulling cash out of the wreckage of the real market to shelter it with the wizard. Some of those decisions were almost poetic in their misplaced faith. Madoff's statements had stopped showing the big financial stocks, the banks and insurers that were imploding. One feeder, marveling, asked him how he'd known to avoid all those toxic financials. And Madoff, with the calm cynicism of a man who held no real positions in anything, said that he believed the big banks and investment houses were destroying the country. He could afford to be a prophet. He owned none of it. But the crisis cut both ways, and the other way was fatal. Because the rest of the financial world was hemorrhaging, the big institutions that had parked money with Madoff suddenly, desperately needed it back. They had margin calls to meet. They had their own investors clamoring for redemptions. They had their own businesses to keep alive. So even though Bernie's investments looked healthy, the money started flooding out the door, not because anyone suspected him, but because the world around him was on fire and his clients needed cash to fight it. And that was the one thing Bernie Madoff did not have: cash. The statement said $65 billion. The reality, in the account at J.P. Morgan Chase where the actual money sat, was a few $100 million against billions in demands. He owed something like $7 billion in redemptions and had perhaps $200 or $300 million to pay them. So in the final weeks, the most respected money manager on earth was reduced to scrambling for cash like a desperate gambler. He pulled every string he could find. He reportedly funneled well over $100 million back from a London operation that had no real clients of its own. By various accounts, he accepted a fresh $250 million from his old, loyal friend Carl Shapiro, the dressmaker who'd given him his first 100,000 half a century earlier, and millions more days later. He had a desperate new fund, Fairfield Emerald, launched in a frantic bid to vacuum up fresh money. He reportedly circulated a 19-page booklet pitching a new investment scheme, hawking it across Wall Street. None of it was enough. The withdrawals kept outrunning the deposits. At Fairfield Greenwich, Jeffrey Tucker, the former SEC lawyer who had started it all, was reduced to writing Madoff a begging letter. "Dear Bernie," it pleaded, "in so many words, we apologize for these redemptions. They're panic-driven. Our whole firm depends on our relationship with you. Our mission is to stay in business with you. The desperation in it is the desperation of a man clinging to a god he doesn't know is already dead." And in the Madoff family, the cracks were showing in quieter, more human ways. Stephanie, married to Bernie's son Mark, watched her father-in-law begin to come apart. Mark told her his father just sat in his office all day, staring at the ceiling. Stephanie walked in one day and saw it for herself. Bernie, tilted back, staring up at nothing, lost somewhere far away. Around the same time, Stephanie and Mark announced they were expecting another child. The first time, it had brought champagne and joy. This time, the grandparents' reaction was strange, muted, off. Ruth blurted out the news in a flat, odd way. Looking back, Stephanie came to a haunting interpretation. She believed that, in that moment, Bernie already knew that another life was being created, a grandchild, into a world he was about to set on fire. He knew the end had come. He'd always known it would. The only question left was how the last act would play. Chapter 15, The Confession. The end, when it finally came, took less than a week. In early December 2008, Bernie Madoff faced a decision he had probably been dreading and rehearsing in his mind for years. The money was gone. The redemptions could not be met. There was no string left to pull. And so, with the cold finality of a man who has run out of moves, he decided not to run, not to hide, not to flee the country with a suitcase of cash. He decided to simply stop. But first, he had to tell his family. On December 9th, he told his brother Peter, who had helped run the legitimate side of the business for decades. Then he gathered his two sons, Mark and Andrew, the young men who ran the proud legal trading firm 2 floors above the fraud, the sons who had grown up believing their father was exactly what the world believed he was, a Wall Street titan and an honest one. He had cooked up a pretext to bring it all to a head. He told the boys he intended to pay out a huge round of employee bonuses, nearly $200 million, months ahead of schedule, even as the firm was hemorrhaging cash in the middle of a global meltdown. It made no sense, and his sons argued against it. And so, cornered by their own questions, Bernie told them the truth. He told them the whole investment business was a lie, that it had been a fraud for years, that he was finished, and that he planned to turn himself in at the end of the week, after the bonuses went out. According to his sons, this was the very first time they had ever heard of it. The moment must have been unbearable. 2 grown men, in an instant, watching their entire understanding of their father, and of themselves, detonate. They were not just heartbroken, they were terrified, because they understood immediately that simply knowing this, and saying nothing, could make them accomplices. They had a choice to make, and they made it almost without hesitation. They left their father's presence, called a lawyer, and turned him in, before the bonuses could be paid, before Bernie could orchestrate his own surrender on his own terms. One of them later described the decision as no decision at all. They knew, right away, he said, that this was the only course of action. On the morning of December 11, 2008, FBI agents arrived at Madoff's Manhattan apartment. They asked him, straightforwardly, whether there was some innocent explanation for what his sons had told them. There was not, Madoff said. It was, in his own words, just one big lie. And here is the detail so many people who knew him could never get past. When the truth came out, Madoff did not seem destroyed. He did not seem to grovel. By several accounts, he confessed with something that looked almost like pride, the air of a man unveiling a masterpiece. Look what I did. You're not going to believe what I did. Here was a man who appeared to feel that he had gotten over on the entire world for 30 years, and some part of him wanted credit for it. One person who knew him called him a monster, evil, said he could not fathom how a man could do that to every single friend, every dear person he'd ever met. Another simply said the man was beyond psychoanalyzing. The struggler from Queens, the boy who was never quite smart enough, who ached his whole life to be respected by people he thought were cleverer than him, had finally, in the most catastrophic way imaginable, proven he could outwit them all. It would cost him, and everyone he loved, absolutely everything. Chapter 16. The Human Toll. It is very easy to talk about this story in numbers. 65 billion, 20 billion, thousands of victims. But numbers are how the mind protects itself from the thing it doesn't want to feel. So set the numbers down for a moment, and talk about the people. Because this was not, in Judge Denny Chin's later words, a bloodless financial crime that takes place only on paper. It was a crime that took a staggering human toll. Bernie Madoff's victims were not only the billionaires and the European royals and the hedge funds. Many were ordinary, retirees who had handed over their entire life savings because a trusted friend swore by this man. Small charities and foundations, some of which were wiped out so completely they had to close their doors forever, and decades of good work ended in an afternoon. Universities, pension funds, towns. People who had never heard the name Bernie Madoff in their lives, who lost everything because their money had been quietly invested, by someone they trusted, in a fund that fed into him. There is a particularly cruel layer to it, one investigators came to call affinity fraud. Madoff was a prominent member of the Jewish community, and he preyed heavily on that community, on synagogues, on Jewish charities, on friends and relatives and the institutions they cherished. Among those who lost money was Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate, whose foundation was gutted. People trusted Bernie precisely because he was one of them, because he moved in their world, sat in their pews, supported their causes. He turned the deepest bonds of trust and belonging into the instrument of their ruin. That is a specific kind of betrayal, and the community felt it as one. And then there are the deaths, because for some, the loss was simply more than they could survive. Thierry de la Villeuche, the French aristocrat who had carried Madoff into the heart of European high society, who had believed in him with the totality of a true convert, who had put in his own money and his family's money and the money of half the royalty he knew, could not bear the weight of what he had done. He had vouched for Bernie. He had lost not only his own fortune but the fortunes of everyone who had trusted him. And barely a week and a half after Madoff's arrest, on the night of December 22, 2008, alone in his Madison Avenue office, he took his own life. His brother Bertrand said that Thierry could have removed himself from the pressure in any number of ways. But the manner he chose, slow and deliberate, Bertrand understood only as an act of atonement, a man who felt responsible, who felt guilty, trying in the only way left to him to pay. He was, his brother insisted, a perfectly honest man, destroyed by his faith in a dishonest one. The horror reached even Bernie's own home. That first Christmas after the arrest, as the hate mail and the threatening phone calls poured in and the world they had built crumbled around them, Bernie and Ruth Madoff, the childhood sweethearts, married since 1959, made a pact. Ruth later described it without melodrama, which somehow made it worse. It was so horrendous, she said, that they decided to kill themselves. On Christmas Eve, the two of them lay down in bed and swallowed a cocktail of pills, and on Christmas morning, they woke up. The attempt had failed. Bernie Madoff would not escape into death. He would have to live, and so would everyone he had harmed. This is the part of the story the gaudy headline number can never capture. $65 billion. It sounds like an abstraction, a video game score. But it was made of human lives, savings that took 40 years to build and one phone call to erase, charities that died, friendships that turned to ash, and people who decided that a world holding this much loss was no longer one they could live in. He hadn't only stolen money, he had stolen futures, and trust, and in some cases, life itself. Chapter 17. The Family That Paid for His Sins. There is a question at the heart of this whole tragedy that Stephanie Madoff would later put into the title of her own book, The End of Normal. Why would a father lay waste to his entire family? And what could make a son feel he had no choice but to pay for the sins of his father? Because the people who paid the most personal, most agonizing price for Bernie Madoff's crime were not strangers. They were his own children. Remember Mark, the handsome, decent, unflashy son who never talked about money, who Stephanie fell in love with precisely because he seemed so unlike Wall Street. Mark, who had spent years quietly tortured by a single recurring fight with his father, a fight that was always, fundamentally, the same fight. Mark would ask, with mounting frustration, what would happen if his father died? What was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to take over a business he wasn't allowed to understand? And Bernie would always give the same maddening answer, "You do your job, and I'll do mine." Mark sensed there was something he wasn't being told. He just never imagined what it was. When the truth came out, it broke him. Mark and Andrew were the ones who turned their father in, an act of integrity that should have been their salvation. Instead, the public, hungry for someone to punish and unable to reach the truth, refused to believe the sons hadn't known. They were sued, they were vilified, they were hounded by the press, and by the trustee, and by the suspicion of a world that wanted the whole family to be guilty. Mark, by every account, became convinced he could never recover, that the stain could never be washed out, that his name and his children's names were poisoned forever. On December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest, a date he chose with terrible precision, Mark Madoff hanged himself in his Manhattan apartment. He was 46 years old. His young son was asleep in the next room. The second anniversary. He timed his own death to the moment his father had destroyed everything. Andrew, the younger son, carried the weight in his own way. He had been in remission from lymphoma for years, and he came to believe, with a kind of bleak certainty, that the stress and grief of the scandal had brought the disease roaring back. He once said the ordeal had effectively killed him, that he was just waiting for his body to catch up. In 2014, the lymphoma took him. He was 48. Both of Bernie Madoff's sons were dead within 6 years of his arrest. One by his own hand, one by a disease he blamed on his father's lies. Ruth, the childhood sweetheart, the woman who had believed in the struggler from Queens when no one else did, saw her entire world incinerated. She lost her husband to prison, both her sons to death, her fortune to forfeiture, and her standing in the only community she'd ever known. In the end, she stopped speaking to Bernie altogether. The marriage that had lasted more than half a century did not survive what he had done. Bernie's brother Peter, who had helped run the firm for decades and insisted he knew nothing of the fraud, was sentenced to 10 years in prison in 2012. And Frank DiPascali, the loyal lieutenant who had run the 17th floor fiction machine, cooperated with prosecutors and died in 2015 before his own sentencing. The family Bernie Madoff claimed to love, the wife he'd been with since high school, the sons he'd raised, the brother he'd worked beside, was, by the end, almost entirely destroyed. He had spent his life building an empire to provide for them, to impress them, to be worthy of them, and in the end, the thing he built consumed every one of them. Stephanie, looking back, kept returning to the same impossible contradiction. How, she asked, could one person be such a sweet, gentle man and such a monster at the same time? How could the shy father-in-law she pulled onto the dance floor be the same creature who stood at her wedding, watching everyone dance, with the knowledge that he had already condemned them all? She never found the answer. Maybe there isn't one. Chapter 18. Justice. On March 12, 2009, Bernie Madoff stood in a Manhattan courtroom and pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies: securities fraud, money laundering, perjury, and more. He insisted, then and always, that he had acted alone, that no one else knew. Few believed him entirely, but he held the line. At that hearing, Judge Denny Chin revoked his bail, ruling him a flight risk, and Madoff was led away to a cell to await sentencing. His lawyers fought it. They lost. The legal maneuvering that followed had a grim, almost absurd quality. Madoff's defense, led, in a closing of the circle, by Ira Sorkin, The very same lawyer Madoff had once recommended to Avellino and Bienes back in 1992 asked the judge for a sentence of 12 years. The argument was actuarial. Insurance estimates put Madoff's remaining lifespan at around 13 years, so 12 would effectively be a life sentence. The prosecution asked for 150. On June 29, 2009, Judge Chin gave the prosecution exactly what it asked for: 150 years. It was a symbolic number, of course. No human lives that long. The federal system listed his projected release date as November of the year 2139, when Madoff would have been 201 years old. But the symbolism was the point. Chin called the crimes extraordinarily evil. He noted something telling, that the court had received not a single letter, not one testimonial, speaking to any good in the man or asking for mercy on his behalf. That absence of support, the judge said, was itself revealing. Even the people who might have stood up for him could not bring themselves to do it. And Chin made clear he didn't believe the scheme had begun, as Madoff claimed, in 1991. He was convinced it went back much further, that the lie was even older and deeper than Madoff would admit. At his sentencing, Madoff offered his words. He spoke of leaving a legacy of shame to his family and his grandchildren, of something he would have to live with for the rest of his life. And he said he was sorry. Ruth, breaking a long public silence afterward, said she was embarrassed and ashamed, that she too felt betrayed and confused, that the man who committed this horror was not the man she had known for all those years. And then Bernie Madoff was sent away to live out his sentence at a federal prison complex in Butner, North Carolina, inmate number 61727-054. Prison life held its own strange footnotes. By later accounts, Madoff adjusted with disquieting ease. He worked as an orderly, earning a few cents an hour. Records eventually showed he made all of $710 over nearly 3,000 hours of labor across more than a decade. He told his daughter-in-law he was treated almost like royalty inside, that inmates called him Uncle Bernie or Mr. Madoff, that people looked out for him. He reportedly befriended a notorious aging mafia boss. There was an early report of a fight with another inmate, which the prison disputed, attributing his hospital trip to high blood pressure. He carried, his last attorney would claim, guilt and remorse to the end, though many of his victims doubted that to their graves, certain he had hidden assets somewhere and had taken the secret with him. In 2020, as a pandemic swept through the prisons, Madoff's lawyers filed for compassionate release. They revealed he was terminally ill, suffering from end-stage kidney disease. Judge Chin, the same judge, denied it, noting that Madoff had committed one of the most egregious financial crimes of all time and that many people were still suffering from it. On April 14, 2021, Bernard Lawrence Madoff died in the prison medical center at Butner of natural causes at the age of 82. He was cremated, and in a final, fitting image of total estrangement, his ashes went unclaimed by what remained of his family. Years after his death, his cremated remains reportedly still sat in a lawyer's office, belonging to no one, claimed by no one, mourned by no one. The struggler from Queens, who had spent his entire life chasing respect and belonging, ended as a number, in a cell, then as ashes on a shelf. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. And yet, here is the twist almost no one expected. When a Ponzi scheme of this magnitude collapses, the conventional wisdom is that the money is simply gone, vaporized into yachts and penthouses and decades of lavish living, scattered across offshore accounts and impossible to recover. Victims of frauds like this typically claw back pennies on the dollar, if anything at all. So when the dust settled and the figure of $65 billion hung over the wreckage, most people assumed the victims were ruined for good. They were wrong. What happened next became one of the most remarkable recovery efforts in legal history. A court-appointed trustee named Irving Picard, working with his chief counsel David Sheehan and backed by the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, took on the staggering task of unwinding the entire scheme and finding the money. And the legal theory they used was both brilliant and brutally fair. Since it was determined that no real investments had been made for years, that it was all just money in, money out, the law treated it accordingly. Some investors, especially the big early ones, had withdrawn far more from Madoff than they ever put in. That extra money wasn't profit. It was, in effect, other victims' stolen money. And so the trustee went after it, in a process called clawback, suing the winners to repay the losers, even those who swore they'd known nothing of the fraud. The recoveries were astonishing. The single largest came from the estate of Jeffrey Pickauer, by all accounts the biggest beneficiary of the entire fraud, a longtime Madoff client who, in October 2009, suffered a massive heart attack and drowned in the pool of his Palm Beach mansion. His widow, Barbara Pickauer, agreed to return a breathtaking $7.2 billion, the largest single forfeiture in the history of American justice. Settlement by settlement, lawsuit by lawsuit, year by year, the money came back. By the most recent figures, the trustee has recovered or reached agreements to recover roughly $15 billion and has distributed more than $14 billion of it to victims, satisfying around 72% of every approved claim. On top of that, a separate fund run by the Department of Justice, the Madoff Victim Fund, finished its work distributing an additional $4.3 billion to nearly 41,000 victims across 127 countries. Add it all up, and the result is something no one watching the rubble in December 2008 would have dared to predict. The victims of the largest Ponzi scheme in history, at least those whose principal losses could be documented, have recovered, by some measures, around 94% of what they actually put in. It does not undo the deaths. It does not give Thierry de la Villouche his life back, or restore Mark and Andrew Madoff, or heal the friendships that turned to ash, or the charities that closed forever. Money cannot pay for those things. But it stands as a strange and stubborn act of justice. An army of lawyers, spending more than a decade chasing Bernie Madoff's fortune across the globe, dollar by dollar, refusing to let the thief win even from the grave. The man got 150 years and a shelf in a lawyer's office. The money, against all odds, mostly came home. Chapter 20. The World He Left Behind. A crime this enormous doesn't just end with a sentence and a recovery effort. It leaves a crater, and the crater Madoff left changed the way an entire country thinks about trust, money, and the people who promise to protect us from exactly this. Start with the regulators, because the Madoff case was a near-fatal humiliation for the SEC. The agency's own internal watchdog produced a scathing report cataloging how thoroughly it had bungled the case. The ignored warnings, the botched examinations, the failure to perform basic verification that would have unraveled the whole thing in an afternoon. Investigators could have simply called the clearinghouse where Madoff claimed his trades were settled and asked whether they existed. They never did. The fallout reshaped the agency. Senior enforcement officials departed. The SEC overhauled how it handled tips and complaints, building new systems specifically so that the next Harry Markopolos, the next outsider screaming the truth into the void, couldn't be so easily ignored. In the broader wave of financial reform that followed the 2008 crisis, beefed-up whistleblower programs were created to reward and protect the people brave enough to come forward. Madoff's name became permanent shorthand inside those agencies for the catastrophe of not listening. His name became shorthand everywhere, in fact. Madoff entered the language as a byword for betrayal on an epic scale, the way Ponzi had a century before. He became the human face of everything that went wrong in 2008. The greed, the blindness, the rot beneath the gleaming surface of Wall Street. As one writer who chronicled the case put it, all the damage the financial crisis did, all the trust it destroyed, somehow came to be bound up in this one-man scandal. When people wanted to point at the era's villainy, they pointed at Bernie Madoff. The culture couldn't look away. His story was dramatized again and again, most famously in an HBO film in which Robert De Niro played Madoff as a chillingly hollow man, and later in a sprawling Netflix documentary series that dug into how the system let him operate for so long. Stephanie, his daughter-in-law, wrote a memoir trying to make sense of the family's destruction. Ruth's tragedy was even turned into a stage play. Decades from now, when the specific dollar figures have faded, the story will still be told, because it's not really a story about finance. It's a morality tale, and morality tales never go out of date. But maybe the most important legacy is the quietest one, And it lives in a single idea that the Madoff affair burned into the public mind: affinity fraud, and the danger of trust itself. The lesson the case taught, to regulators, to investors, to ordinary people, is that the most effective con artists don't look like con artists. They look like the most trusted person in the room. They are the chairman, the philanthropist, the family friend, the man everyone vouches for. Madoff proved that the credentials and the reputation and the warm handshake are not protection against fraud. Sometimes they are the fraud. That's a hard lesson, because it asks us to be suspicious of exactly the things that make us feel safe. But it's the lesson Bernie Madoff left behind, written in $20 billion and 3 ruined generations of his own family. Trust, he proved, is the most valuable currency there is, and the easiest one to counterfeit. Chapter 21. Why he did it. Which leaves the only question that really matters. The one everyone who has ever studied this case keeps circling back to. The one Bernie Madoff himself could never answer. Why? Not how. We understand how. Now. The no-fee leash, the velvet rope, the black box, the confirmations mailed late so the trades could be invented after the fact, the fictional statements printed on a hidden floor and chilled in a refrigerator, the regulators hypnotized by his prestige, the feeders too drunk on fees to look, the investors too grateful to ask. The machine is no longer a mystery. But why build it in the first place? That's the part that breaks the usual logic of greed. Most con men steal because they need to, because they're broke, or cornered, or chasing a fortune they can't get any other way. Bernie Madoff had a fortune, a real one, a genuinely successful, world-famous, legitimate company that made him more than $100 million a year and put him in the chairman's seat of a major stock exchange. He did not need to steal a single dollar to live like a king. He said so himself. Asked, finally, why he had done it, he gave an answer that explained nothing. I had more than enough money to support my lifestyle and my family's lifestyle. I didn't need to do this. I don't know why. I don't know why. Maybe that's the truest thing he ever said. But if we set his own shrug aside and look hard at the life, a more satisfying answer begins to take shape. Not a proven one, to be clear, but one the evidence quietly supports. Trace the thread back far enough and you arrive in Laurelton, in that modest red brick house, at a boy who was always the struggler, always falling just short, never quite smart enough for the girl, never good enough for the honor society, watching his smarter classmates sail past him year after year. Based on what we know of that boy, it's reasonable to suspect that the thing driving Bernie Madoff was never really about money at all. The money was just the scoreboard. What the available picture suggests he truly hungered for was the win, the need to prove, once and for all and to everyone, that he was the cleverest man in any room he walked into. And the most delicious proof of cleverness he could imagine was to fool the people he'd spent his whole life feeling beneath, the geniuses, the aristocrats, the regulators, to make them not just trust him, but thank him, while he quietly took everything they had. Read through that lens. The dark genius of the velvet rope stops looking like a marketing tactic and starts looking like the man's entire psychology, turned inside out and bolted onto a business. He spent his life desperate to be wanted by people who'd once made him feel small. So he built a kingdom where the most powerful people on earth begged to be let in, and felt blessed when he allowed it. We can't crawl inside a dead man's head and prove this. But if you're looking for why a man with everything risked it all, the boy who was never chosen becoming the man who did the choosing is about as coherent an explanation as the record allows. And it was never enough. A hunger like that never can be. There's a larger lesson here too, and it's not really about Bernie Madoff at all. Because Madoff could not have done this alone. He didn't. For every clever lie he told, there were 100 people who chose not to hear it. The feeders who didn't ask, the bankers who took the kickback and looked the other way, investors who flipped to the last page and felt rich, regulators who saw the red flags and decided a man that respected couldn't possibly be a crook. The fraud wasn't really built out of one man's evil. It was built out of thousands of people's willful blindness, out of the universal human willingness to not look too closely at something that's making you money. That's why one man with a flashlight and a spreadsheet, Harry Markopolos, could see the whole thing in 4 hours, while an entire industry and a federal agency couldn't see it in 16 years. It wasn't that the truth was hard to find. It was that almost no one wanted to find it. So the next time something seems too good to be true, the returns too smooth, the story too clean, the man too respected to question, remember the velvet rope. The most dangerous con isn't the one that pressures you, it's the one that flatters you. The one that makes you feel chosen. The one you'll thank, right up until the moment it takes everything you have. Bernie Madoff stole $65 billion, and for the better part of 2 decades, he made the whole world thank him for the privilege. Which makes this less a story about money than a story about the rest of us.